Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today.
Hi, Jack.
Hello, Tricia. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am doing fantastic.
Well, welcome to the show. I should have asked you behind the scenes, but is Jack Maher correct?
It is Jack Maher.
Maher, thank you. I am so sorry for that. Today
okay.
we have with us Jack Maher. He is a journalist, ex-TV producer, and the author of Poppy, a novel about Eric Douglas. Jump in and tell us more about Eric Douglas. And it's a nonfiction book, correct?
It is a fiction in places, but it is based on a real person and real events. So it's called Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. And this man, Eric Douglas, was one of the people who helped launch the Denver Art Museum's Native Arts Department. Back in the day when he was associated with it, it was called the Indian Arts Department. And this man was a tireless champion of Native American art and the people who created it. And he also was an innovator in the way in which this art was displayed. And this man happened to be my grandfather.
Oh, wow. What a neat connection. Yes, I was looking at your website and talk about the time period of his life.
You bet. He was born in 1897 up in Evergreen, Colorado. And his father was a really talented musician for the Episcopal Church. His whole world was writing hymns. He particularly enjoyed a type of music called plain song. And if you've ever been in a church setting where there is almost like a Gregorian chant with just these beautiful voices, but it's, no instruments, that is kind of what plain song is all about. And so his dad devoted his life to the pursuit of that music and trying to incorporate it into the Episcopal Church's hymnals. Well, he was originally from New York, and he worked himself pretty much to exhaustion. And his superiors back in the 1800s, the late 1800s, said, you know what, you need to get yourself healthy. And they sent him out to Colorado, which was something that was done a lot back then. People with lung problems and other medical problems were sent here because of our dry air. And, they just felt that the high altitude was a good cure for that sort of thing. So his father, whose name was Winfred Douglas, came out to Colorado. And as part of this regimen, he actually spent several months in the Southwest in what was then known as Indian country. And he just took a horse and a bedroll, and he slept out under the stars, and he started to acquaint himself with a lot of the native people, particularly the Hopi. And he got better. He improved his health, just really solidified. And as part of this experience, the Hopi just loved this man because of, just here's this guy that comes out of nowhere to try to get better. And they took him into their home and appreciated, him for who he was. And he certainly appreciated the Hopi for who they were. And he generated this love for their art and their culture and their history. And they made this man, Winfred, a blood brother. They called him Tall Pine Tree because he was a rather tall man. So he developed this love, as I said, for their art and their culture. And when Eric came along after his dad married this pioneering Colorado doctor, Dr. Joe, when Eric came along, I think he just passed on this love to his son. And so his son was eventually asked by the Denver Art Museum to create this department. And up until that point, a lot of Native American artists and their art were not really appreciated. There was a lot of racism. Hollywood was sort of stereotyping, what Native Americans were all about. And so Eric really made it his mission to change that through showcasing this artwork. And I should tell you, Tricia, that he was recruited into this job by Ann Evans. And I don't know if that name is familiar to a lot of people, but she was the daughter of one of our territorial governors who was rather infamous, Governor John Evans, who was associated with the Sand Creek Massacre. He was governor when that happened. And Anne, I think because of that and the horror of that incident, really dedicated herself to trying to right the wrongs, as it were. And one of the ways was to fund cultural institutions in Denver, including the Denver Art Museum, and asking Eric to help her in this mission. And so he founded this department, and he started putting this artwork that he and his father bought and collected on display. And to this day, the Native Arts Department at the Denver Art Museum is like the premier place in the world for this kind of art and for the way it's displayed.
Yeah, and embarrassingly, I've lived here for almost 20 years now, and just maybe a year and a half ago, for the first time, went to the Denver Art Museum. But I walked through that Native American section, and it's amazing. It's beautiful the way the art is displayed. Feels very inspiring and magical.
Yeah, and the thing that was interesting about Eric Douglas, and again, we called him Poppy, that was his family name, was that he was ahead of his time in so many ways. He was fighting the tide in terms of the way that a lot of white America was looking at Native American art and artists. But as I said, the display methods, just brilliant. He had a collaborator in New York who was named Rene de Harnecourt, and he was connected with the Museum of Modern Art. And both Eric and Rene were on these parallel paths to make museums more interesting. Because up until that point, up until, say, the 1930s, if you were to go into a museum, a lot of the stuff was behind glass cases. My grandfather would say it was trapped under glass, and that the only people that would want to see that stuff were what he called eggheads that were really into the topic or the subject. And so between he and this collaborator, Rene, they changed all that. And the idea was to sketch what a museum visitor would see, the point of view as they walked into the exhibit space, what was on their right, what was on their left. They would do these three-dimensional depictions of what they wanted to do with the art. They'd put it up on pedestals, or they'd put it in a niche and then would light the niche dramatically. They would paint walls to match the geography of where this particular object came from. In the case of the Native American artwork, Eric had a friendship with a noted Hopi potter named Nampayo, and she lived atop a mesa in Hopi land. And for her pots, she would descend the mesa down to the floor and the desert floor, and she would sort of scrounge for a lot of scraps left by her ancestors from hundreds of years prior. And she would look at these scraps of pottery and be inspired and take those patterns and sort of make them new works of art, in the pots that she would create. Well, getting back to how this was displayed in a museum, there was a little seed pot, and Eric decided to paint this wall the color of sage to reflect the sagebrush from which, Nampayo would draw a lot of inspiration for her work. And their efforts were recognized multiple times over the years. They collaborated at the Golden Gate Exposition in San Francisco in the 1930s at a massive, interesting place that was actually an artificial island. And this whole thing was built to commemorate the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge and the Oakland Bay Bridge. And so the people behind this effort asked Eric and Renee to create an exhibit hall for Native American art. And again, imagine this. This is an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The Army Corps of Engineers built this thing. And then they put this, what was called the Indian Hall, on the island along with these other exhibit spaces. And at night, they brought in these multicolored searchlights that shot hundreds of feet up into the sky. And so you would see this if you were to come into San Francisco and look out into the bay. And somebody called it Magic City because it just looked so unusual. And the only way you could get out to it was by water taxi. The island is no longer there. It was a product of just this period of time when this fair, this expo was open. But they used a lot of these techniques that they developed in Denver and New York in that exhibit. And then they also used a lot of the same techniques at New York's MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, for an exhibition of Native American art in the 40s. And these creative men had such an impact on how museums displayed their art. It is still in effect today. If you go into that space you mentioned at the Denver Art Museum today, a lot of those techniques they developed, and they're still being used today in Denver and museums all over the world.
Yeah, I could definitely feel that when I walk through the different areas of the museum, especially that one. Just you feel encapsulated and surrounded by that environment. So it really brings out the art. So it seems like they really had to have, or Eric really had to have, an eye for architecture as well as interior design, and putting all those together to create this aura or of walking into the artist art, right?
Absolutely. And I'm going to give you a couple of specific examples of what these guys did. At the San Francisco Expo, they had a beautiful mural as you walked into this Indian court, is what they called it back then. And on that wall was a war party on horseback. And the artist depicted them, sort of coming at you, the perspective of the painting. But rather than just having it as a flat mural on the wall, they embedded real feathers on the headdresses of these riders. And then they had a tube of compressed air that was hidden behind the wall that then blew the air onto the feathers so they rippled. And as as you walked in and you saw this, it was as if these riders were coming at you with the wind in their faces. Very, very innovative for 1939, very, very innovative for 2025.
I would, yeah, that creates that illusion of the motion and the action and being immersed in whatever scene you're in. That's really neat.
And in New York, at the exhibition there, they commissioned these kiva makers from the Hopi culture to come in and recreate non-sacred kivas, because kivas are sacred in the Hopi tradition. And the way you make them non-sacred is by leaving out certain details. But they commissioned these artists to recreate, the kivas you would typically find in the desert in Arizona at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And so visitors, as they're seeing the different works, part of that was going through these kiva replicas. And again, that is something that I think you could still argue to this day would be a great way to experience another culture, is walking through something like that.
Most definitely. Well, talk me through writing the book, because did you talk to your grandfather? I mean, are these like stories that he told you and then you remembered them and wrote them down, or how did that?
Boy, I wish that was the case, Trish, but honestly, a lot of my growing up years here in Denver, I really didn't know much about this man. To be truthful, we had a rather dysfunctional little family, and we were affected by a lot of things. There was alcoholism, there was mental illness, and so I just had sort of this broken family, and learning about my grandfather was way down on the list. Well, one day, my grandmother, I sought her out because things had gotten really bad for my brother and I said, we need your help. And my dad had died at a young age. My mom, was really struggling to keep this little unit together. My grandmother, whose name was Frida, she came in and stabilized the dysfunction. And she made sure we had clothes on our backs, and she paid the rent, and we had, good food to eat. And to this day, I don't think I'd be talking to you today if it was not for her. But as part of that stabilization, one day she came into my bedroom when I was a teenager, and she had in her hand a copy of a Denver Post supplement they used to publish called Empire Magazine, and it was all about the history of Colorado. And this particular cover story was about the Douglas family up in Evergreen and all they had done, and this beautiful home that they lived in, which at the time was called Camp Neosho when they lived there. It's now known as the Highwan Homestead, and it's a museum that you can visit. Anyway, she handed me this supplement and said, Jack, you may want to hang on to this. It's about your family. And, me being a teenager, more interested in girls and dances and rock and roll, I was kind of like, okay, fine. And I tucked it away. And really, that was the only reference she made about her life with Eric and with, everything that Poppy had accomplished. Well, fast forward, I worked at 9 News for many years. And somehow the Denver Art Museum heard about this connection between me and Eric Douglas. And they called me up at the newsroom one day and said, hey, we have a society dedicated to your grandfather. And I did not know that. It was called the Douglas Society. And they said, we're wondering if you'd come lecture to the society. Well, I just was panic stricken. I had a newspaper supplement that my grandmother had given me years before and very little knowledge about Eric Douglas. And so I cobbled together this kind of bumbling lecture in 2012. And when I was done, I think I did okay. But I said to myself, you know what? Now that I know a little bit more, enough to be dangerous about Eric Douglas, this man needs more than this lecture. And so I promised myself that I would write this book someday. So I was able to retire from my busy TV life and later my Jeffco Public Schools life as a multimedia journalist. And so it took me 2 years and a lot of research. Both Eric and his dad were prolific letter writers and diary keepers. And I was very fortunate to have the Denver Art Museum and the Highwan Homestead Museum open up their archives to me boxes and boxes of material. And so my challenge was to kind of distill it all down and hopefully make it interesting. And the reason I made it a novel, there were gaps in the record, and I had to fill it with my imagination. And I'll give you one quick example, if I may. So these two men, Eric and his father, Winfred, were on an outing on horseback through the Four Corners region in the 1920s. And his dad kept this diary while he was making this trip. And it was a multi-week trip. And this particular entry said, today we had a good day. We found water for the horses and the mules because they had a mule train for supplies. Beautiful sunset, nice place to camp, good grass. Oh, and we rescued a mule from a pine tree. Period. Well, when I read that, I said, there has to be a story here, but I have no other information about that. And so I used my imagination to sort of backfill how the mule got in the pine tree and how they got him out. And so that happened a few times in the book.
Neat. I mean, did the mule climb up the pine tree? Or was he stuck at the pine tree?
Yeah, well, you're going to have to read the book to find out.
No spoilers here. That sounds so neat. Yes. So my great grandfather was born around the same time. It sounds like your grandfather was born, and I was privileged to know him until I was 16. And I
Oh,
look back
wow.
at that sometimes and think, wow, if I'd have been an adult when he was, and had that many
Mhm.
years with him, like how many times would I want to just, I mean, because he went to both world wars, and like how many times would have wanted to sit down and him just
Right.
talk to me about his life. So I can imagine it would be very neat to go back and just discover his life and his father's life and your family.
Well, I'll tell you, you were very fortunate to know him, in your teen years, because for me, I was 2 when Eric died, and he succumbed to just a terrible bone cancer that actually took one of his arms off. And so I just have this sort of scary kid memory of this tall, one-armed giant. And that was the extent of my actual connection personally with Eric. What was really interesting about this man was he had this other life in addition to what he did for the Denver Art Museum, because in World War II, he was asked by the War Department to head up a hospital in the Philippines and to bring 100 plus nurses from Colorado to staff it. And they were on the front lines of the Pacific War. And so during the war years, he commanded this contingent of nurses, and they saw horrific injuries, as you can imagine, from folks coming back. And a lot of these were what was known then as shell shock. We, of course, call it PTSD today. And Eric, because of the musical background that he had from his father as the Episcopal music liturgist and all that, somehow knew that music had a healing quality for people that suffered these kinds of traumas. And so when he was at this hospital, he organized the patients with shell shock into choirs. And he wrote home to Evergreen and asked his dad to send musical scores to this hospital in New Hebrides, so that he could, keep these guys going with music. And so again, that whole theme of innovation carried over into the war years, because I don't think a lot of people at the time were even aware of the potential for music to help heal brain trauma.
Yeah, it seems like he was definitely a multifaceted, outside of the box thinker, just coming up with solutions to enrich people's lives.
There was no question of that. And after the war, again, think of the time, but his name Poppy had somehow become Pappy by the nurses. I don't know how that ever happened, but they called him Pappy, and he called them his chicks. So it was Pappy and his chicks. And to sort of commemorate the end of the war and their service together in the Philippines, he wrote a book of verses for Pappy and his chicks. And for every one of those nurses, he had a fun little rhyme that he put together. And he published this little booklet, which he gave to each of them to commemorate their war years. And for as long as he lived, until 1956, they would get together annually and have this little reunion. And they were a very tight group. And he didn't want them to know about how sick he was with the bone cancer. He was always upbeat, and I'll see you next year. And, there wasn't a next year after that last reunion. But he just had this ability to forge these friendships that were really important to the people that had them. And I'm just thankful I was able to highlight some of his life in this little book.
Yeah, it's really neat because, like you were saying, like your grandfather and your great grandfather kept these journals and wrote lots of letters. Definitely my great grandfather, my grandparents, and even my mother, she still keeps a journal to this day. And I just think about the fact that nobody in my generation, I mean, I guess some people do diaries of their feelings and things, but I feel like nobody in my generation, I mean, I could go back and look at my pictures and know where I was on my phone, right? But I haven't written out like where I was like every day of my life for, for eons. So, I mean, maybe some people do, but I think we won't have a lot of those like written histories that we've had in the past.
And I'll tell you, I'm worried about that because for historians or writers like me, what a gift to have that physical, asset from the past. Whether it's a diary or a letter or a journal, in handwriting. There is just something so visceral about being able to hold that in your hand. And for me, as the writer of this book, it really did help me find voices for these various people that came into and out of the lives of the Douglas family. And I'm just thinking of someone, 10 years, 20 years, or even now, that wants to do something about the 2000s and going through tweets and pictures. That's, the current version of what was done last century and the century before, centuries before. And it's going to be a very difficult thing for, I think, a lot of future historians and writers to go back and really find things that are going to actually mean something to help guide them in their writing. I'm worried about that. I got to be honest.
Well, it's interesting because what people put on social media isn't necessarily who they are and how they are authentically, right? So you're just putting a lot of times a caricature of yourself out there. So
yeah, I don't think when my grandfather wrote that diary, when he took that trip with his son, this was the real deal. It was just a day by day account of what they were going through, and he certainly wasn't trying to impress anybody. It was just for him and for the family. And these days, it's true, we do put our other self out there. We manufacture this identity, and a lot of the time, it is not really reflective of who we are.
Interesting. Well, I've learned I didn't grow up in Colorado, so what knowledge and history I have of Colorado is sort of limited to what my kids learned in school or that I've been to the Four Corners area and some areas of Colorado, but I have a lot more exploring to do. So thank you for bringing a little bit of piece of Colorado history today and your novel about Poppy. Tell us where we can find your book and where we can find you if people are more interested.
Well, absolutely. If you will go to my website, it's a bit of a mouthful. I apologize. It is sandgoatmanorpublishing.com, all one, sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. And there you will find links to where you can get the book. It's also been selected by the Colorado State Library for virtual book clubs. So if that is your thing, you can go to my website and learn more about that. I've also got some multimedia there, Tricia, because of my work at 9 News and later with Jeffco. I have a story there about the Highwan Homestead Museum where a lot of the book is set, as well as a photo gallery. So there's a lot of stuff to check out on the website. So I hope you do. And since you brought up kids, the Highwan Homestead Museum, if I can just give them a quick plug up in Evergreen, is a great place to take kids to learn about the early days of Colorado, not only the Douglas family, but the other family, the Buchanans that inhabited this place. And they get the chance on school field trips to load a covered wagon, and they get a math lesson while they're there. Okay, you've got this amount of supplies and this much space in the wagon. What are you going to do to prioritize? And how are you going to make sure that you don't overload the wagon so you don't kill your oxen? So there's some great benefits to visiting, whether it's with a school group or just on your own.
Well, I'll put that one on my list. And it's funny because so I'm an East Coaster, and I was hiking a couple of years back with 2 other East Coaster friends, and one of them had just moved like a couple of months before to Colorado, and we were on a hike, and it was a pretty high altitude hike, and we come along a cabin. I think it's in Gateway or Golden Gate State Park, and we come along the cabin, and they're like, okay, it's the typical Colorado cabin. Somebody came up here to live and they died. And we were kind of joking about it, but that was the pioneering spirit back then. So
think about what that took when you look at a cabin like that, or you come across ruins in some isolated place. I think about that all the time, especially in the wintertime.
Yes.
And surviving that with just a little pot-bellied stove in the corner, it's incredible.
Hardier people than me, definitely. Well, thank you so much for being here. And if you write another book, I hope you will definitely come back.
Thank you, Tricia.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.